Over again, but really looking forward to this talk. So help me give them another round of applause and welcome.
Okay, so I'm Brian. As you can see, the talk is titled 112 Years of Vulnerabilities. As someone pointed out already, the schedule said 111, so we have a RADA, that and how time moves forward. I actually started working on this presentation and gave it for the first time last September, but it was a real small group, and I've been kind of building on it since then. This is a talk about perspective. It's not a technical talk, so you don't have to take notes. Hopefully I'm going to tell some stories that will amuse you, and at the end we'll see where we end up. First, a few quick rules. If you have questions, please wait until the end. If I'm wrong about something, go ahead and blurt it out. If I'm actually wrong, I'll buy you beer all night long. If I'm right and you're wrong, then you buy me beer. So you've been warned. For those familiar with my presenting in the past, you know that I'm usually a bullet and chart kind of guy. That presentation style does not work for this talk, really. So as you can see, also, you can't really believe any stats. Quick disclaimer. That was legally binding. Thank you. We're all adults here, right? Yeah? Okay, so those are the rules. Who am I? I'm just a guy who likes small, misunderstood creatures. For those who know me, yeah, I'm the guy that likes squirrels and guinea pigs and everything. But the part that matters is I collect things. I've always been a collector, even as a kid. And this matters because right now I collect vulnerabilities. This is actually out of date already, and I updated this 2 days ago. So we're over at 106,803 vulnerabilities, 85,000 products almost, over 112 years. And it's kind of interesting to see those numbers. And we'll get into that a little more later, why those numbers are probably all wrong, too. So what went into preparing for this talk? I read a lot of articles, these kind of articles. They're fascinating to read. And then when you go digging past that, you get even more information. I also read all kinds of fun papers from back then. Not sure if you can quite read those dates, but those were all early 70s. Also mailed a lot of old people in the industry and said, hey, man, I don't want your Zeroday. I want your 10,000 day. Had a lot of great people respond and give me some perspective there. And also read some books. For those of you who don't know, there's actually a ton of security books from back in the 70s. I have 12 to 15 of them now. Fascinating reads, because 90% of what they say, you could just change the date. It's all accurate. This is going to be a depressing talk at first. We're all going to be sad and being like, oh, why do we bother? Hopefully by the end, though, we'll change your perspective and you'll be a little happier. We know the state of the industry right now. We're not very good at what we do. We think we are, but in the long run, hopefully this will give you more historical perspective to fully understand and appreciate exactly where we are. And with that perspective, maybe do better. For those who know this quote, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. This is a very appropriate quote for our industry. This was also, by the way, attributed to Shepard, Burke, Vonnegut, and Jesse Ventura, but there's the actual guy who said it. When does vulnerability history start? 10 years ago, if you asked me, I would have said maybe the 1960s, because we kind of associate some of the early computers back then. About 5 years ago, I would have said no, maybe the 50s. 3 years ago, I might have said the 30s. But now I think a better time to start is 1902. And when you think about what the world was like in 1902, it's a very different world than we live in now, obviously. The important part of choosing such a date is remember that it's kind of, it's a little bit about perspective, but it's also crossing privilege boundaries, which we're all familiar with. You know, basically what makes up a vulnerability or an exploit. So with that in mind, we start with the Marconi wireless telegraph. Back in the day, everything was wired, and then one day Marconi says, hey, we're going to beam our information out over the wires, which is pretty familiar to us today. It was invented in the years leading up to 1903. It was a significant advance of the time. And by significant advance, I mean, you know, there was news about it and everything. The primary creator was an Italian named Guglielmo Marconi. He had assistants John Ambrose Fleming pictured and Arthur Bloch. And I really feel bad for Bloch. I couldn't find a picture of him. And I'm sad because he was actually a more central part of this story than anyone. He was kind of like the hacker in the room, yet he doesn't get any of the credit. So anyway, Marconi, like security vendors today, he claimed his device was secure and his messages were private. And he boasted, I can tune my instruments so that no other instrument that is not similarly tuned can tap my messages. He basically said you can't eavesdrop on my stuff. Okay. So to show off his new device, he set up a public demonstration. He got the news there. It was in this big theater. He was in Cornwall, 300 miles away himself, but he had his two assistants in the theater with all the media and the people. Kind of like a hacker, he was like, yeah, I don't want to deal with people. So right before the message he was sending came in, his assistant Block heard a weird tapping in the lantern, just like a rattling, and he's like, something's wrong, something's weird about this. You know how it is, you're typing away and you're like, Matrix style. Then Block said, wait a minute, that's Morse code. And he thought about it, and he's like, wait a minute, how is this lantern rattling off Morse code? And he figured out someone was beaming in their own signal, and it wasn't Marconi. So Block listens, and he realizes it's saying one word over and over, rats, rats, rats. It's kind of weird, but he knew what was going on. Shortly after that came the string of crude insults and personal attacks against Marconi, true troll style. Marconi wasn't happy about this. The entire demonstration was kind of a flop. Like some security vendors today, though, Marconi said, I will not demonstrate to any man who throws doubt upon the system. Basically, hey, you found a bug in my stuff? I'm not going to talk to you. You're just wrong. Just trust me. Oh. Hey, free booze. This is great. Wow. Okay. Excuse me. So yeah, he basically said, yeah, I'm not going to listen to your silly bugs or whatever. His main man, Fleming, though, pictured later in life, he wasn't so, rigid about that. He sent a fuming letter to the Times of London, dubbing the hack scientific hooliganism, which is an awesome term. Think about it. Next time you want a fun card for your business, put that as your title. So much like the vendors today screaming, that's not a vulnerability, it's a design feature, Fleming basically said the same thing. And he tried to enlist the paper to say, hey, help me find out who did this. Fortunately for him, 4 days later, a different letter came to the Times, and it was gleeful, and it confessed to the entire hack. And so we have probably the world's first modern hacker that we know. This fine mustached gentleman is a stage magician and an inventor. That's kind of like the forefront of hacking, right? He decided to troll Marconi and show him that his notions of private were a joke. So this is John Neville Maskelyne. Marconi's patented technology for broadcasting on that precise wavelength or whatever, it was shattered before it even went to market. So we kind of look today and say, a vendor comes out with something in beta and it just gets demolished. That's basically what happened here. But this also gave us the first two vulnerabilities that I have in the database that I manage. We have transmitted message remote disclosure, basically sniffing the airwaves, and then also a spoofing weakness. Two vulnerabilities we're pretty familiar with. Most of the stories that we read in there, but the story actually goes deeper. Maskelyne was apparently hired by the Eastern Telegraph Company to undertake spying operations on Marconi a year before all of this. So yeah, there's all kinds of drama and intrigue behind this, which is cool. The cool part, Maskelyne had written this article in November 7, 1902 in The Electrician. And thank Google, I actually found the original, copy of the original, obviously, where he disclosed everything he did. So Marconi boasted about his security the whole time the entire exploit was written in a publication that he presumably should have read. And you compare that today with the issues of full disclosure and hackers and trolls, and everything here is just, common to us. So anyway, that's a neat story. I want to dig into it a little more. There's probably all kinds of fun info there. So now we jump to basically the World War II era. It actually started, as far as the vulnerability side, in the 1920s through the 40s. A lot of countries were using electromechanical rotor ciphers. Who in here is familiar with the Enigma? That's one that most people will know, yeah. Basically, the Enigma and several other machines was invented by a German engineer. It was used, like I said, 20s to 40s in a variety of ways. The first break of the German army Enigma, because they had different models, was by 3 Polish cryptographers. First one, Rajewski, he reverse engineered the device using theoretical mathematics and material from French military intelligence. So using a combination of actual intelligence and math, he figured out how the device worked. He kind of built his own prototype of it and broke it, which is pretty cool. Over the coming years, subsequent models would be designed, used, and broken in the same manner. In Japan, we had the 97 Shikiyobon Injiki. Sorry for the pronunciation if it's way off. Wait until you hear my French later. Means alphabetical typewriter 97. But we don't want to remember that. So one thing that the crypto world does really good, they use code names. We'll just call this Purple. And Purple intercepts diplomatic transmissions dubbed Magic. Nice and easy. This came in 1937 after the 91 Shiki-in-Jiki, a.k.a. Red, that had significant weaknesses. 1940, this was broken by a U.S. SIS team. Then we had the Siemens T-52 Geheimschreiber, codename Sturgeon. May 1940, cracked by the Swedes. And the Swedes had one huge leg up on all of their counterparts. They could actually tap the hard line and get all of the communications from one of these devices. So when you're doing the cryptanalysis, if you are able to get that much material, it just makes it easier to break. Excuse me. Then we also had the Lorentz SZ40, SZ42A, B, et cetera, et cetera. This was cracked in 1942. We're going to call this one Tunny. Know it or not, we can thank this little beauty for the entire world we know. What was the first computer built? Anyone? First computer, come on. Right, no, wrong, right. Everyone thinks it's the ENIAC. It's not. It's actually the Colossus. The Colossus came 3 years before. The difference is that when someone says, hey, it's the first digital computer, this was the first single-purpose computer. This thing did one task, and it broke crypto. Kind of interesting. So in 43, it was built, and for how many years, all it did was break crypto for these machines. This was 9 feet high, 16 feet long, 10 feet wide, drew 5,500 watts of power, and is about as powerful as your phone. The 1950s gave us rise to the phone freaks. Most of us are familiar with the later history of phones, but we have to remember that the early devices, the switches, were electromechanical, and eventually they would evolve into digital computers. In 55, the Western Electric Labs panel machine switching system had an issue. It predated the classic blue box by several years. User-supplied input, a 1,000 megahertz modulated signal, would seize a trunk between 2 cities, and with that trunk, they could basically talk to the remote end and say, hey, operator, connect me somewhere, and they would get the free long distance there and then connect it outbound. So you had your first phreaking essentially using that kind of methodology. Actual phreaking goes back 50 to 60 years when the lineman would tap into the hardwire. In 56, the Western Electric Crossbar, General Telephone, Stroger, step-by-step, they suffered from a different issue. The exploit at the time was known as the black box. For you freaks who came up in the 70s and 80s, this was a different black box. There was a race condition. You pick up your phone, you slam it down, and you do this several times really quick, and the remote system would be like, whoa, wait a minute, are you on, off? I don't know what you are, and it would not kick in the billing system. So if you did this in the right order, you know, at the right frequency, you pick up, your next call is free. And for perspective real quick, all of this happened before Hawaii became a state. So when we think about the history of computers and vulnerabilities, you know, most people, like I said, they kind of go back to the 60s or 70s. 1960, the Western Electric Labs 4A crossbar. This is the infamous blue box. Are any of you old enough that actually built or used a blue box in here? Anyone? Statute of limitations is up. Come on. Yeah. Yeah. So the blue box, carefully timed 2,600 tones, and we're all familiar with 2,600 now because of that. Or for you musicians, it's the 7th octave E. You throw that down the line, you trick the remote switch into thinking the trunk is free call. And that's where the phone company learned the hard way that user input was a bitch. And we still have this problem today, don't we? So over the years, people figured out both toys and electronics could be used to circumvent the system to make free calls. the freaks would, end up abusing the system for over a decade, well into the 70s. So, like I said, toys, Davy Crockett's bird call flute, one of the early freaks, he figured out that as you kind of modulate it, you could do it at the right one to hit the frequency needed. Real fascinating stuff. Who recognizes these criminals? Anyone? Yeah? This is Jobs and Wozniak. While they came much later, it gives a recognizable visual for the abuse of the phone systems and reminds us that some of our computer empire today was built on crime. Kind of another neat little side history thing I've been researching for a while. So now the computer history we're familiar with. And by that I mean, visually we look up and we say, yes, that's a computer. The 1960s brought us real multi-user machines. And that's why a lot of people associate vulnerability history back this far. Once again, privilege escalation, privilege boundaries, crossing them. This is the IBM 7094. It's the first multi-user computer system that I'm aware of that has software vulnerabilities resulting in privilege escalation of some kind. And these came from 62 and 65, actually into 66. One of the interesting ones is there was an offline printing issue. Excuse me. When a user made a request, like if they just requested the password file, computer system like, no, we're not going to give you that. But they said, hey, computer system, print that file. Oh, sure. So it would print the password file, and they could run to the printing cabinet, and if they were the first one there, they had every user's password. Not a lot of security behind that, we know. Overall, in the world of vulnerabilities, the 60s were a blip on the radar. The 70s brought us a lot of fun. Yes, that does say Robotron. No, it's not the cool arcade game. This is a German company called GDR that made that. And then we get into games. Who grew up with Oregon Trail? And pretty much everyone in here should raise their hand on that one. So Oregon Trail, this is kind of a little cheat for me to get it in the presentation because Oregon Trail was mostly a single-user game. However, toward the end of its history, you could actually play it over TTY, terminals and phone lines, and there was kind of a multi-user element. So anyway, it was like 7 or 8-year-olds figured out, what happens if I put in -100 for the number? Endless money. What do we call that today? Underflows, integer overflows, underflows, yeah. So 7-year-olds figured this out before we did. We're cool. Who here's worked on a PDP-10? Who's actually seen one in the field? Yeah, come on. They're still used today, primarily financials, and that's kind of scary. Manufactured in 66, it was actually carried into the 80s. Like I said, there's still a few out there, and they're running mission-critical systems. Panic on that one. Ran one of two operating systems, either TOPS 10 or 10X. In 72, there was a timing attack vulnerability that allowed a user to figure out a different user's password. And it's important to note that this was a true timing attack against virtual memory paging. This is like really advanced because what do we use timing attacks for today? Almost nothing. When a timing attack is disclosed, most vulnerability databases, we read it, and it's like, yeah, that's cool, that's academic, theoretical. No one's ever going to use this. But this is actually used back in the day. Kind of makes you wonder, wait, all these timing attacks we're dismissing left and right, do they really have a lot more merit than we understand? Honeywell DPS-6 running GCOS 3, or General Comprehensive Operating System. In 72, 2 vulnerabilities were discovered, and another in 79. One was to abuse the TS-Fortran compiler to execute commands outside the security envelope. Outside the security envelope. This is also sounding kind of familiar to me. The other one was a file system module, not handling buffers, allowing for the disclosure of arbitrary user credentials. And you'll start to notice a theme with people wanting other passwords. The Tutor programming language was developed for the Plato 4 computer system. Nice, sleek, aerodynamic machine right there. You launch that off. Yeah, anyway. With a crafted ext command sent to a remote terminal, you could lock it up and require a power reset to fix it. So now we have our first remote denial of service going back that far, 1974. 39 years old. MIT's Honeywell 6180, one of the many computers that ran Multics. Who here has actually used Multics before? We're going to have a talk. You keep raising your hand, yeah. Actually, there's an entire website called multicians.org, and all the old, geezers, they get together and they talk about multics, and their body of knowledge is incredible. It's fun talking to those guys. In the 70s, there were at least 16 vulnerabilities in multics, and I'd like to point out that when I first gave this talk it was actually November of 2013, I only had 10. So in the past half year, I've gotten 6 more multics vulnerabilities, and that tells us that there are probably a whole lot more before that. Statistically, multics was kind of the oracle of the 1970s with the amount of vulnerabilities it had. I'm not going to apologize to Oracle for that one. Early 1979, anyone recognize him? It's Roger Shell. He is basically like the patron saint of pen testing as far as anyone should be concerned. He led a Tiger team while at the Naval Postgraduate School. He did this on behalf of the military, the U.S. military, and he did it against the Multics operating system. So during the test, not only did they find vulnerabilities and find more vulnerabilities, something else interesting happened. They wanted, like a lot of black box engagements, they wanted persistent access to this machine. So they put a backdoor on it, right? Who here has backdoored something for a pen test? Yeah, a lot of us have. Sometimes it's fair game, sometimes it's not. So anyway, come to find out, it wasn't just a military Multics. It was actually the Honeywell machine running the master copy of Multics. So he backdoored the vendor's copy. Yeah, that's kind of serious. So being an upstanding guy, he and his team went to Honeywell and said, oh, hey, we put a backdoor in your system, please remove it. And they said, okay, and he described it. And he's like, oh, this is how many lines we used of code, which was next to nothing. This is, the magic password where we can get full access. And Honeywell said, thanks. And they came back to him later and said, still can't find it. That's not very comforting. So this went back and forth a bit. And eventually Honeywell said, screw it. And they started shipping that backdoor with every copy of Multics afterwards. So in 1979, we have our first U.S. government backdoored operating system. Yeah, right now we're all panicking over that thought. Was it 94, 2004? The NT key and Windows NT, or the NSA key. Yeah, so way ahead of the game here. What's actually interesting in I guess the 3 days leading up to this, I was doing more digging. This is the second time they backdoored Multics, and they did it to Honeywell. The first time it was, fortunately for us, a harmless backdoor. Mileage may vary on that one. So let's jump to the Model 91 IBM 360. IBM 360. This one is used at NASA, and we know that because it has way too many buttons. It ran OS 360, one of 3 variants, and 74 was found to have an access restriction bypass. But the cool part about 360 is that the software is still used today. Not only are there a few of these like mainframes still floating around, IBM supports it through the Z-series computer. So like, day to day when we're monitoring vulnerabilities for the database, we see stuff in the Z-series. However, more fascinating, between 1964 and 2005, when this thing was used, 1 vulnerability in it. By those numbers, this is probably statistically the most secure operating system in the world. It's kind of cool. Of course, it's also one of the most unusable and unfriendly, but, there's reason that this doesn't catch on. Yeah. Yeah. I'll go back to VMS, I think. If not, I'll tell you afterwards. So after 2005, when they kind of modernized it and made it ZOS, then the floodgates opened and 33 vulnerabilities were found since then. So yeah, 1 vulnerability up till 2005, then 33 after. So something to be said for the hardware it runs on, I guess. This is a PDP-11 at Tottenham College in 78. Ran RSTS, multi-user time-sharing OS from DEC. In 75, 4 vulnerabilities were identified, including denial of service, arbitrary user credential disclosure, file disclosure, and an unspecified remote issue with a login process. And that last bit to a vulnerability historian is very interesting. So rather than full disclosure, we have limited disclosure from the admins of a system who saw the vulnerability actively being used. So this was detected in the wild, and they said, we don't want to share the full details with everyone. So historically, this is probably the first time someone said, well, full disclosure may not be the way to go. That's Rafiq on the left, by the way, and who said geeks aren't sexy? Look at that. Xerox 560, capable of running CPV, which he's probably run since he ran everything else. In 75, vulnerability was found that allowed a user to bypass the built-in memory protection to elevate privileges. Yeah, I rattled that off quick, but bypass the built-in memory protection to elevate privileges. And that sounds a little bit like a sandbox. If you don't think memory protection bypass is serious, consider that 33 years later, Azimuth Security gave a talk titled How to Impress Girls with Browser Memory Protection Bypass. So 33 years ahead of the game. PDP-11 again. Anyone recognize those two? Come on, you probably worked with them. Dennis Ritchie and Ken Thompson, those names should be familiar. They're the modern day computing heroes, creators of Unix, which is the basis for basically every modern operating system other than Windows. AIX, HP, IRIX, BSD, Apple Mac, or Mac OS X, Unicos, Linux, even onto the Android. In 1975, an unspecified vulnerability was found in the login process related to array checking. So again, we have another vague disclosure, this time from HP Labs. So yeah, we know HP Labs for doing one of the bug bounties. They happen to, be into this long before that even. That may have been one of the first vendor disclosures, if you count them as a vendor, even though they probably didn't really own the software. 6 years later, there was another Unix v6 issue found in the SU program. After that, dozens and dozens more vulnerabilities would be found in Unix. So the floodgates kind of opened on that one. Let's see, IBM 370 punch card system, part of a larger computer system that ran one of 4 different operating systems. In 77, privilege escalation, and in 79, a password file disclosure. And at this point, we have to keep looking back. Why are these password disclosures popping up every single time? Why are we still using passwords to this day when it just doesn't work year after year? For the math people in the audience, crypto people, new data seal algorithm based on Lucifer, created by Horst Feistel and his colleagues at IBM. This was a commercial cipher. Before this were military ciphers. The details are kind of fuzzy, but I'm working on it. A whole lot of reading and digging needs to be done, and I'm not a math guy. So it's basically read 2 pages, drink, read 2 pages, drink. Stop, next day. You can only process so much of that if you're not a math person. So in 77, the NDS cipher was found vulnerable to a slide attack, resulting in a full compromise. It's one of the early computer-based algorithms that fell, and would be one of hundreds following it, including DES, which we all know and love. So by the 70s, vulnerabilities were coming up more and more often, and some of the people out there were concerned about this, especially the military. They said, well, wait a minute, things are largely moving to computers, there's vulnerabilities left and right. We're not too happy about that. Back then, most people weren't security people. They were admins. They would spend all their hours just keeping that machine running. And back then, it wasn't, recompile the kernel and everything's good. It was actually, a day-in struggle to keep that machine physically running. So by the 80s, vulnerabilities were so prevalent, some people decided a list of them should be maintained. And these kind of were the early vulnerability databases. And it's kind of a loose term. To me, a vulnerability database is any collection of vulns. I don't care how little or more much information you include about them, it counts. They were different today's, but the same intent and goal: catalog all the vulnerabilities. Before the 80s, the original VDB was likely the repaired security bugs in Multics. This was from 77. So yeah, when I was digging around, I already had some Multics vuln, and I ran across a reference to this. I was like, it's the holy grail to a vuln historian. I'm like, whoa, got to have this. So yeah, go online, and there's 0 reviews. And I'm like, yeah, I got to review this when I'm done, which I still haven't done. It was kind of disappointing. Anyway, the image that you see, it's actually, I later found out, a generic image that Google Books use. So it wasn't actually a book. I was like, what a letdown. But I had to get it. So I said, let's find a copy. And Amazon didn't have it. Abe Books didn't have it. And I said, well, the library, they've got to have it, right? 941 miles away. And yeah, who wants to go to California? So logical reserved response. I was quite upset at that. But things got better. When I gave this presentation to like 8 people last year at UPenn, one of the professors there, she had done a request, an intro library request or whatever, and bam, I had a copy waiting for me. Ended up being 6 pages. It wasn't a book. But ultimately, I got my 6 more Multics bugs, so it was a win. And then I gave this presentation last week, since we're on this topic. And again, it was a group of 20 people, a little private deal. And afterwards, a guy comes up and he's like, oh, well, blah, 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 military history. And I was like, yeah, you sound pretty cool. And he's like, well, I worked for this one group. And I was like, yeah, NSA. And, he's using these like vague words. And he's like, oh, then I did support for this. And I was like, the agency. And then I did this. And I was like, Spec Ops. Okay. I was like, you're pretty badass and you're designing crypto for him. Okay. So he hands me 2 books. One of them, military cryptanalytics. Sorry, I'm still butchering that. Part 1 and Part 2. Anyway, Part 1, all high-level stuff didn't help me. Part 2, sitting there reading it on the plane, reading it. And I was like, man, I was really expecting... They don't like to show that. For the record, it was declassified in 2005. Wow. It's kind of spooky. So anyway, I finally get to Appendix 6. This is like 30 pages that are going to take me 30 months to go through and try to figure out. So in the span of like 20 minutes of talking to this guy, he's probably doubled, tripled, or more my knowledge of historical crypto machines. Fascinating stuff. So hopefully this trend will continue, and afterwards one of you cool people will come up here and say, oh, by the way, here's some great info, and it's like really old. So start thinking about that, and please. 80s. Much more familiar to us. Why? Computers are smaller, and more importantly, they're prevalent. Computers are starting to be everywhere. After the repaired security bugs in Multics, you have more efforts to catalog. This came in the form of mail lists and also concise list of vulns. And I'm switching tracks a little bit here because there were so many that had to be cataloged. And when you think about it, if so many bugs exist that you need to catalog them, then it should be a warning sign. And a lot of us back then, we didn't take it as such. After the Multics list in the mid-late 80s, we saw several other people cataloging the Unix security mail list in 84, Matt Bishop's Unix whole list in 85, Rutgers in 85 by Al Walker, Hobbit, Phage mail list in 88 by Gene Spafford, and Zardoz in 89 by Neil Gorsuch. Those are all fascinating reads. You can get almost all of those mail lists on a couple sites out there. There's still some missing ones. So if any of you are really old and you have like full copies of those mail spools, a lot of people would be your friend to get a copy of it. There was also additional lists like the Unix known problem list, the UC Santa Cruz hack method list, and there's also an alleged internal Sun Microsystem bug list that had all the exploits to go with their bugs, which would be really cool to get my hands on. I need to go mug Casper Deek, I think. So there's other ones that I've gotten my hands on, still working on integrating. But the cool part is all these people were working on doing the same thing that I do. So they're kind of my heroes. In the early 90s, I was following in their footsteps, even though I was only familiar with some of those lists. I was affiliated with a hacker group back in the day. And like any good hacker group, we maintain our own list of bugs. This is it. Well, kind of, a sampling. So we kept it in files.bbs format so that we could share it easily. By that I mean with hardly anyone, just a few people we knew. This stuff was like gold back then. But what was interesting to me is that even back then, I was using a classification system, what I called the OSAT guide, which told me the operating system, whether it was remote, local, whatever, and ultimately the impact of it. And you jump to a lot later when the first big VDBs came out, like ISS X-Force and security-focused BID and CVE. None of them use classification systems. And even the vulnerability database I worked on, we didn't add one until 2004. So yeah, shame on us, all of us. And then yeah, we had the actual OSAT guide so that you could translate that. And by this point, there were dozens of books on security, Unix, VMS boxes all over. It was the early years of the internet, and this is the entire internet in one convenient map back then. But the cool part is this gave hackers a chance to easily get to other systems, and in doing so, they could explore them. And in doing so, they could also find more and more vulnerabilities. Even the home PCs were running BBSs by this point, and BBSs had their own vulnerabilities. A lot of people don't remember that. Most of them were either I can remotely crash the BBS, the op wakes up and he has to, restart the system. But some of them were more about downloading any file on the system, bypassing restrictions. Because if any of you use these, remember, well, I can only upload like 3K and download 10K per 24 hours or whatever. Bypassing that was convenient. The late 70s and early 80s gave us a new look at denial of service attacks. If you think you have a bad time dealing with DOS attacks now, this group, Clodo, and I'm not going to butcher the long French name for that, when I gave this talk last week, right as I finished the slide, Renaud, the creator of Nessus, walked by. It's like he heard my butchering, kind of glared at me, and he was in the next room. It's kind of weird. So anyway, these guys said, well, we're not going to, send packets to you. We're going to do arson and bombs. And they would go around and blow up computer installations at big systems, these big companies. So yeah, they were pretty hardcore about their denial of service, and it had a little more lasting effect. So we jump to the 70s and 80s, and we also get our first taste of SCADA vulnerabilities, and this is really cool. So after this one in 83 was disclosed, it would be 17 years later before we got our first SCADA disclosure. It's a big jump. And while that's a big jump, the story from 83 is the fascinating one. So, yeah, here we go. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, issued an information notice. Not an advisory, not a critical advisory, not a, oh shit, you should panic advisory, numbered 8383, and it was about portable radio transmitters in nuclear power plants. Seemed harmless. When you start reading through, you started to get a feel for what it meant, and it was basically, you use your walkie-talkie, stuff shuts down. That's not very comforting. So that was in 83 that they issued that. The first incident actually occurred at the Farley nuclear plant in 75. Technicians figured out a differential relay is radio frequency sensitive, and that's basically the nice way of saying it falls over when someone uses a walkie-talkie. Let that sink in. Walk into a facility, use a walkie-talkie, and bam, nuclear power issues left and right. Can't be good for us. And I say first incident because there were more. Second was at Sequoia in Tennessee, May of 79. Tech's walkie-talkie sent a signal, a Spurrier signal to all 4 channels of a pressurizer initiating a safety injection. And that's their words for, oh shit, something bad happened. Pressurizer is a component to pressurize water for the reactor. When you think about reactors and how hot they get, stuff that cools them, we need that. Third incident, 3 Mile Island, 82. Basically, their walkie-talkies told their own safety gear that you can't breathe. This air is too bad for you. So yeah, they went probably running out of the room screaming. Fourth incident at Grand Gulf in Mississippi, July of 83. We lost a shutdown causing a cooling loop to up and fall over for 30 minutes. And again, cooling loop. So is it more scary that a walkie-talkie caused this, or it took 8 years for the NRC to say, hey, rest of you should be aware of this? But wait, more good news. It was rediscovered at Davis Bess in 2011, just a few years ago. Emergency water cooling system lost for 2 minutes. Since giving this presentation, I've filed FOA request to the NRC, and according to them, I'm going to get my reports. That means I actually get to find out all the hardware that was vulnerable, and that's kind of cool because it's all probably still being used. So if anyone wants to shut down a nuclear power plant, please don't. So now we're up to the 1990s. This is really the rise of the vulnerabilities, as you can see. Everything we've covered up until now leads to that little spike. We saw comprehensive vulnerability databases pop up. The 90s had 2,369 documented vulns, and in reality, there's thousands more. Just have to go dig into them. This is also why I don't think graphs work for the presentation, because that's pretty boring. I look at that and I'm like, ooh, let's play colors, and or if that doesn't work, I start playing tic-tac-toe and I start to lose focus. So yeah, hopefully you'll understand why I'm telling stories for this one. Up to 94, you saw primarily Unix-based vulns, local and remote, encryption algorithms like GDES, Snefru, Kafra, Redoc, Loki, Lucifer, Bassomatic. Yeah, crypto people are weird, but they have cool names for their stuff. They were falling like flies. 1994 hits, Pandora's box opens. Why is 1994 significant to us? No, the web. Basically, the internet becomes the internet. We knew it was the internet, but everyone else starts to think, hey, this is cool. So commercialization of the internet, birth of the World Wide Web, roughly. It's arguable, I know. And a lot more rapid deployment of applications, which saw an eternal fountain of web-based vulnerabilities. Over the next 15 years, vulnerability counts would skyrocket. By the way, that's the first web server ever. I love the little note on that. Don't shut me down. So the turn of the century saw a frequently changing landscape. New technology came out. New vulnerability classes were identified, but not really many of them. By this point, we knew all of them. Not all of them, but most. There was a big shift to large databases, big data, whatever you want to call it. Everything was going to the web, web accessible. Vulnerability research matured greatly. That we can agree on. But we saw a steady stream of crap. 2006 especially, we saw a huge spike in cross-site scripting and SQL injections. And these were basically little kidiots saying, oh, here's some script tags and here's a backtick, and report it. And it doesn't matter if you could actually exploit it. It was close enough. These vulnerabilities would be disclosed without a vendor URL sometimes. It was horrible. Anyway, I got to speed up a little bit. We learned that anyone could be a security researcher. To this day, it plagues us. We saw vulnerabilities disclosed in systems that seem obscure, but in reality have a bigger impact on us. So electronic voting, I consider that pretty important. Back in, I think it was 2008, 2010, there was an academic paper that basically showed not only are these machines vulnerable, that one or two people with a little custom cartridge could rig an election. And by that, I don't mean a district, I mean a state-wide election. Pretty scary stuff. We saw vulns in automobiles, not only being able to key past the lock systems, but we saw issues with braking and ECUs. There's also real-world attacks on those. If any of you want your own motorcycle, go to your local Ducati dealer, type in the 4-digit code to start the bike without the key, the default 4-digit code. We also, for those who were here earlier in Scott's talk, medical, this goes back to 85, the Therac 25, race condition, and one of the things, this race condition didn't give you root, it killed someone. Yeah, little details like that. Interesting research into ICDs, which he probably covered. I'm sorry I slipped in. There were these ICDs basically had Bluetooth and said, hey, you can interface with me for diagnostics, but no, you don't need authentication or encryption. Just interface. Thanks. And we know that's bad because Dick Cheney decided to disable the wireless feature of his ICD 1 year before all of this was disclosed and 5 years before the Homeland plot, which made the news. We saw Jay Radcliffe give good information on insulin pumps, and after going to the vendor and saying, hey, these are really bad, I could die if someone did bad things to it, the vendor's like, oh yeah, that's pretty serious, we're not going to fix it, thanks. So he swore off using an insulin pump after that. Security products, who in here uses any kind of computer security product? Yeah, all of us. 2% of my database are vulnerabilities in security products. So we're adding layers and layers of vulnerabilities on top of it. It's like, hey, we're going to close a few and open a few. Mileage may vary. So ultimately, what are we saying? Everything's the same. Absolutely everything. We have new exciting devices, sure, but we have the same old vulnerabilities. And now it's even become an industry unto itself with bug bounties. In 2011, sharp rise of bounty programs. The first one, by the way, goes back to Netscape in 1995. They figured it out early on. So when you're reading all these articles about the history of bug bounties and they're like, yeah, 2006 or whatever, just walk away. Both companies and online services started it. What used to fetch a couple hundred, maybe $1,000 is now fetching up to 6 figures. Who knows how much more? To the point where the payouts are getting bigger and bigger. For example, Google has paid out over $1.01 million to date. That's Google alone. And those are the disclosures I'm aware of. And yes, I have the exact figures in a spreadsheet and all that because I'm kind of out there. But they also, what's interesting is Google pays out not just on their own, but they've actually paid for vulns in OS X, OpenGL, Windows kernel, libxSLT, libxML, the NVIDIA drivers, FFmpeg. And it's kind of interesting that they're paying for vulnerabilities in other people's software so they can fix it because they use those libraries. My database hit the 100,000 mark on cataloged vulnerabilities on December 25th. Merry Christmas back then. That was last year. We're, considerably further now. So what lessons have we learned? All of these vulnerabilities that you see and you're like, hey, yeah, that's a cool vulnerability. They're not new. They're very old, very old. Clear text transmissions, 1902, crypto failure, 39, modern crypto, like mechanical, sorry. Trusting user input since 55, overflows, 83, SQL injection, 98, cross-site scripting, 99. And those dates are kind of, tentative. Research may show that they are older. We'll see. But I'm not the only one saying this. We remember Shell here. He wrote a paper in 2002, 30 years after his Multics research, and he basically said that based on what he's seen in his 30 years of computing career, he said that the modern systems, they wouldn't cut it as an open system in the military. And those of you who know SPAF, he wrote a paper or a blog a couple years back, and he basically said the same thing. He said, this is dismal. We're not going anywhere. And then we have to ask why. Quite simply, because we're not addressing the underlying problem. Instead, we're doing Band-Aids on top of Band-Aids. And instead of fixing the issues at the root problem or at the root cause, we're just coming up with new exciting ways to profit off of them. So we have blinky lights and colorful buzzwords, and it'll better protect us. Then we have to ask, will your cloud-based holistic DLP solution protect you from the BYOD threat? Does that actually help any of us? No, of course not. So as a security industry, we sell degenerate solutions that treat symptoms, not cure the disease. We go to conferences, we preach to the choir, and yes, I've given this more outside of the security industry for this reason. And yes, I'm guilty. I preach to the choir too. Sorry. And ultimately, we're like these guys. We look good, but we don't do much. I know, guys, I'm real close, sorry. We spend countless hours debating full disclosure and how much time to give vendors, while some of them take 3, 5, 10 years to fix something. The age-old question is, how do we fix this? I'm a breaker, not a builder, so I'm not the best one to answer this. But we have all these smart vendors with industry-leading whatever they've got. Shouldn't they actually be fixing the problem, not Band-Aid? So I can offer you perspective and some food for thought and a small dose of reality. The only way this is going to get better is if we make it personal. One of the things I will say at some conferences, the only way to make it personal is when you have either children or dead people involved. And it's a grim reality, and I know that. But when you think about it, that's kind of how it works. So web cameras are a great example. Web cameras, they all have default passwords, if any. They allow anyone to view the stream by default. That kind of thing. A few years back, the Federal Trade Commission said, well, wait a minute, Trendnet makes these cameras, and the FTC went after them in court. And they basically said, look, you're calling your product secure, and it's not secure. So why did the FTC go after Trendnet when all the cameras do it? Because someone wrote an article that using Trendnet cameras, anyone on the internet can see my sleeping baby in the room. They made it personal, and the FTC said, hey, we don't like that. So it gives good perspective on how we can change things. Also interesting is the FTC has levied $34 million in fines and consumer redress calculations. Yeah, but basically $34 million since '98. So companies are starting to pay attention. Maybe if we start smacking them harder and harder, it'll work. But ultimately, we've shown that the design and the code's not getting better. The vulns are all the same. We have fancy tools, SDLC, DevOps, standards, certifications, auditing. None of it matters. It's all the same. So that's what I have. Quick thanks to all these people. Also, ShakaCon, the AV people are probably the best I've ever been or seen at any conference. So really, thank you guys. And with that, questions. And now we have 3 minutes worth.